great crowd. Thank you all for being here. And those of you who were with us last week, thank you. It was a rainy, yucky day, and it rained the entire time. And so those of you who braved the elements, thank you. Okay, today we have Stephen K. Smith. The title of his presentation is Adventures in Virginia History. Stephen K. Smith is the author of 20 books, including The Virginia Mysteries, Brother Wars, and Final Kingdom series for middle-aged readers. His titles have sold nearly 500,000 copies, and he has spoken regularly at regional industry and literacy events in over 250 elementary and middle schools. His latest book, Conspiracy at the Launch, features an exciting mystery tied to space rockets, NASA, and Virginia locations like Wallops Island and Langley Research Center. Stephen lives near Richmond, Virginia with his wife, 3 sons, and a golden retriever. Stephen came highly recommended. He has books for sale in the back after the presentation, so let's welcome Stephen Smith.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll try not to knock that over. But thank you for being here and having me. My name is Steve, and excited to get to talk a little bit about my books and being an author and history. And I'm sure you might have lots of questions, and we'll have those some time for that at the end if you have anything about any of the different series or some of the different places in history. But I always like to start by talking about just creativity. And as Susan said, I speak at a lot of schools and classrooms. A lot of my series are targeted for middle grade readers, so generally between ages 8 to 12, or a couple of the series a little bit older than that. And one of the things I really like to encourage kids to do is think about using wonder and imagination and their creativity. And I always like to ask them, who likes to be creative? And I always, when I speak to adults, I like to ask the same thing. You can raise your hand. Who likes to be creative? There's lots of ways, whether it's with writing or music or art or sports or dance or just about anything, there's a way that you can use creativity to work that in there. And I think that's something that's certainly as an adult, it's easy to kind of forget that. And one of the reasons that it really draws me to writing for middle grade kids, they're kind of centered around that 4th grade student, is, that's the time of young kids' lives where they're really becoming aware of themselves and the world around them and discovering what they're good at and what they're interested in. And it's a really fun part about being able to influence them at that point in their lives. And I know for me, that's a lot of when I really enjoyed and got into reading and different types of books that are still very important to me. But I will show you, and it's fun to kind of mix in a few slides that I showed to some of the kids as well as ones when I speak to adults. And I'll show you something that we like to do as a warm-up when we're doing writing workshops with children is think about what's something that kind of can get your mind going. And I don't know if you're anything like me, but sometimes when I sit down to write, sometimes it can be a little bit hard, especially if it's in the morning. My brain is a little bit slow to work. My coffee hasn't sunk in yet. And a little tip that I use that I talk to the kids about, and if you're trying to do anything creative or even writing or other types of creativity, I think it works as well. Just like if you're doing any kind of activity, sometimes you'll do a warm-up. And for me, doing something to get your mind off of what you're supposed to be doing sometimes can be the best way to get started. So I like to use some pictures of using your imagination. There we go. Everybody see back there a little better? Of ways to get your imagination going. And I always think, in particular with elementary school kids, it works well to kind of use silly pictures. So just briefly, you can use your imagination and think, if I was to show you a picture like that, can you imagine a story that you could come up with about this guy riding on a chicken? And always think about, is this a miniature guy on a regular sized chicken or a regular sized man on a giant chicken? It could be either one, right? And one of the fun things about using your creativity is that, as opposed to a lot of other topics in life, there is not always a right, and a lot of times there's not a right and a wrong, which I think is fun to be able to kind of color outside the lines a little bit and be able to use your imagination and be able to develop that part of what you're interested in. Another fun one is this one. I always think this looks like a Jedi dog out in the woods or something in a blanket. So just that as an example of some of the things, we show this to kids that are 8, 9, 10. They have a lot of fun just kind of going to town and thinking about what are some of the different things that they come up with a little story about one or both of those pictures and what could they do with that. So that just gives you a little taste to kind of get your own imaginations going, and I'm guessing none of you will go home and write a story about one of those pictures, but you're welcome to if you want to. But believe it or not, that was me when I was about the age when I was writing for kids, and it's always fun to show that to folks because, you know, when I was in 4th or 5th grade, I had no idea that I was going to write and be an author, write any books, let alone as many as I have. I thought that I was going to be a professional baseball player, and unfortunately that didn't work out. Or my backup plan was to be a park ranger and work and take people on hikes and work in the woods and all kinds of things, and that's still one of my favorite things to do. But that didn't end up being my profession. But what I did know was that I loved to read, and some of the books that are still very important and some of my favorite books even as a grown-up are books that I was reading in 4th and 5th and 6th grade, books that are the same age as what I'm writing for, books that maybe you've heard of or might have read yourself, books like The Chronicles of Narnia, or Where the Red Fern Grows, or The Bridge to Terabithia, or Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim, or Wrinkle in Time. Those are all books that were really important to me, and it's fun to kind of work with kids and inspire them a little bit about what that might be. This is actually something I've saved this from 3rd grade. This is the first thing that I worked on and wrote with some friends in class for an assignment about the adventures of Ping, a little 5-page picture book about a panda bear that travels around the world on a magical umbrella. So I show them, even when they're in 2nd or 3rd grade, the things that you're starting to do now and the things that you practice for throughout your life, I think can be a fun way to kind of get you going. And then another thing I found, somehow I saved all these old book reports. I think I'm the only kid I knew at the time that had a copyright page on my book reports and a little thing at the bottom where I had my own SKS publishing company, which is funny. And I say that, you know, even at that age, you don't know some of these little things that meant nothing to me other than I just thought it was a good idea. And lo and behold, you know, the last 14 years, I've had my own publishing company. So it's just kind of fun to look back and see those little seeds that you might be planting or kids might be able to just sink their teeth into. I didn't write my first book until I was in my late 30s, and you don't really know what that's going to turn into. So that's a lot of fun too. But I grew up in New Jersey, believe it or not. As much as I write a lot about Virginia, that's not where I'm from. And I think sometimes when you grow up in a place, things can kind of blend in, I like to say, become wallpaper almost, and you kind of forget about the interesting and exciting things that are all around you. And while New Jersey has a whole lot of important history in its own right, from Washington crossing the Delaware to the Statue of Liberty to up to where I grew up in northern New Jersey, the High Point State Park, which is a big monument to the highest point in New Jersey that folks in Virginia probably would know nothing about. You know, when I moved to Virginia, everywhere, okay, I see a hand, there we go, I like that. When I moved to Virginia, I found that everywhere I went seemed to be full of history. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But I started when I have 3 sons, so when my 3rd son was born, they were 3 boys under the age of 5, which was a lot of fun and a little bit crazy. And does anyone have, I know I talked to a few people that have 3 boys. Anyone else that has 3 boys in their family somewhere? Probably quite a few of you. And so one of the ways I think that I tried to release some of that anxiety and deal with what was going on is I started blogging. And I was a couple of days a week, I would write a blog post about all the crazy adventures that were happening in our house. So I called it My Boys 3, and this was literally our first blog post back in 2009 about a camping trip I took the boys to, and everything seemed to go wrong. And that kind of got me going of kind of getting used to expressing some of my ideas and thoughts and putting them out in the open, which I talked to a lot of writers or young writers or older emerging writers, that can sometimes be one of the hardest things, is getting a little bit of a thick skin and getting used to putting your thoughts and ideas out there into the world. And I think for me, that actually helped a lot. And over the years, I had probably 200 or 300 blog posts just about different funny things that happened. So that was kind of my first writing foray. And then we moved from New Jersey to Virginia. So I live in Midlothian, just 30 or 40 minutes away, not too far. And like I said, everywhere I went around Virginia, Richmond and all parts of Virginia, literally every corner seemed to be dripping with history. So I was a political science and government major and history major in college. So it was always a lot of interest to me. But I didn't know very much about Virginia. I moved here and my wife went to school in Williamsburg and grew up in Roanoke. So I knew that. And I saw lots of these signs all around and knew that Virginia must be a loving place, which I think is a good thing. But what I quickly found out, as most of you probably know, especially here at the Society, is that Virginia is for history lovers, and there's obviously history everywhere you go, but Virginia just seems to be extra jam-packed full from all different periods of time of all kinds of history. And I just thought that was fascinating because I can tell you when you grow up in New Jersey, you know a few things that are in Virginia, but you just don't know it in the same depth that like our fourth graders in the public schools are usually learning about Virginia history. So there was a lot of things to sink my teeth into, and it kind of led into what we're talking about a little bit more. So I mentioned I have 3 sons. So this is when they were a little bit younger, and sometimes they kind of acted like punks. So that's them over on Belle Isle in Richmond, I think, at a time. This is them last year, so somehow they've gotten a lot older. So now they're two are in college and one's in high school. But when they were younger, one of our favorite things to do with me and the boys when it was bedtime, especially the older 2, was we like to read books at bedtime and tell stories. So we read through all of the Narnia books or Magic Treehouse books or old classics like Tom Sawyer or Swiss Family Robinson or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So I had a pretty good idea about the kinds of stories that they like. So one weekend, I was on a business trip out in California in San Diego, and I had a little bit of extra time in my hotel. So I decided that I was going to make up a story that would be for my 2 older sons at bedtime. So I started to make up this story, and it was about a couple brothers who moved from up north, and they moved down to Virginia, which was a lot like what our family had done. And they moved into an old house with some really tall trees all around, which was a lot like the house that we moved into in Virginia. And the brothers started going out and exploring around, and there was a creek that ran through the woods, which we had behind our house, and there was one like where I grew up. And as they started to explore around, they started to find some old coins in the woods, a little bit like this one up here. And so I started making up that story for my kids, and they seemed to like it, so I kept on working on it. And even though when I started, I really wasn't sure what this would turn into, that turned into my very first book, which is called Summer of the Woods. And my kids seemed to like it, and they showed it to some of their friends, and they liked it. And then surprisingly, and this is where when I talk to writers, there always needs to be a little bit of a mix, I think, of good fortune and hard work mixed together, and it's great when the 2 happen at once. Surprisingly for me, a few months after Summer of the Woods came out, the elementary school that my kids went to in Chesterfield County picked it to be their school-wide reading program. So suddenly several hundred families in my town were reading this book that started out as a bedtime story, which was really surprising. My wife couldn't quite believe it either. But it was really fun, and a lot of people seemed to like it. So I started to do research into, okay, what's the best way you can promote your book? And I started to come back, well, the best way to promote a book is to write another book, which was a little daunting, but I said, okay, I can try to do that. So I decided to make it into a series, and I called it the Virginia Mysteries because it kind of mixed together 2 of my favorite things, some of these fun adventures and mysteries, with this really interesting Virginia history that I was learning about along with my kids and family after we moved to Virginia. So I like to describe them, they're kind of like a modern day Hardy Boys Nancy Drew, and you can kind of see that. We try to follow that style with the covers to kind of have a little bit of that nostalgic feel like that, but with different historical places that they're set at all around Virginia. So they're fictional, real present day, modern day mysteries, but I work really hard to get the history that they run into, and we're going to go through some of the different places the books are at, try to get that really accurate, and I do lots of research, and that's one of the fun ways for me to try to figure out what's a way that I can find some of these really cool ideas from different parts around Virginia and events and people and history, and there's more than obviously than that I'll ever be able to put books to, and mix it together with a mystery. So we'll go through in a minute. I'll show you some pictures from some of the different places of what there's now 12 books in the series. So it's fun to kind of have all those out there for folks to sink their teeth into. I have 2 other series that I'll just mention briefly and that are also for sale in the back. Brother Wars is a 3-book series about 2 other brothers who, as you imagine, don't quite get along very well. I don't know where I get these ideas from, but it seemed to be flowing pretty easily at my house over the years. It's kind of in the air, I think. And they have all kinds of misadventures, like forcing each other to go on a canoe ride down the river in a canoe that doesn't float very well, or going to a weekend sleepaway camp at a camp up in the mountains that I made up, and all kinds of things go wrong. Or the Brother Wars. I used to live in New York City for 3 years, so in this one they go to visit their grandma who lives in New Jersey, and she takes them into New York because she wants to try to get on the Today Show. But all kinds of things go wrong, and they get lost, and grandma might get kidnapped, and all kinds of things. So I think she'll be okay. But there are kind of these misadventures of these 2 brothers that have to be together because they're brothers, but they just can't seem to make it work out. So they're lots of fun as well. And then I have a third series that's a little bit different. My kids sometimes play way too much Xbox and Fortnite, and I'm sure you know lots of young people that are doing the same thing. So what if I wrote a series that was tied into video games? Maybe they would want to read instead of playing so much Xbox. Unfortunately, I don't think that worked out as well as I hoped it had. But it turned into a three-book complete trilogy. So it's about a 13-year-old named Zach whose older brother disappears. And he may have gone missing into the virtual world of their favorite video game called Final Kingdom. So it's a very fast-paced, complete trilogy, and they're lots of fun, and there's more of a sci-fi virtual adventure. So they're a little bit slightly older age group, more of a middle school kind of age group. I usually say like 11 plus. So that's a quick overview just to let you know kind of what I write about. But since we're here at the Historical Society, one of the things I mentioned that I really try to lean into is the history. And one of the things that I find is that kids and grown-ups, love history. I've always found it fascinating because all of the world is just a collection of stories. And I think sometimes it gets a bad rap, especially with kids in school, sometimes as being boring or just filled with dates and different things. But I think when you mix it together, and I always think of some of my favorite movies or stories or books, right, is looking at something in history, but they're tying it into a specific place or an event or people or family. I always think of like Saving Private Ryan, that's focusing on a huge thing like World War II, but they're tying it into a particular family or group of people, and that's how you get to experience the bigger canvas of the story. So I think that's something that I try to do and mix that in there, in emphasizing the people, not just the dates and facts, and looking for connections. Well, I'll show you some pictures in a minute. One of the books, Mystery on Churchill, starts out at St. John's Church in Churchill in Richmond, and there's a lot of things that's there. It's famous for being where Patrick Henry gave the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. So I'm sure a lot of you maybe have been to that. But in the cemetery there, George Wythe is buried, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and then he lived at Williamsburg, where you can go to the Wythe House. So connecting those two places together as part of the story is a fun way to kind of tie these connections and put different elements in history together. Places to experience and visit, I regularly, which is a really fun thing to receive, I regularly get letters and emails from not just families in Virginia or teachers, but from outside of Virginia as well, where they're talking about the fact that they love, for them and for their families, to be able to have that kind of push and pull idea with the stories of reading about someplace and being more excited to go visit Mount Vernon because their kids or they have already read about that. So it can kind of really encourage, we all know sometimes how hard it is to motivate kids to want to go and do something or do an outing or a trip, and having that extra little bit of enthusiasm can kind of help. Or the other way around, a lot of reluctant readers, and in my experience, they tend to be more boys than girls, but that kind of varies obviously by the person. But sometimes that reluctant reader needs just that little bit extra push, especially in today's age, I think of video and all these short bites to get into. We all know, or a lot of us know, how fun it is to sink your teeth into a good book, but you kind of have to slow down and get into that. So having just something a little bit more to kind of start you down that path can be really helpful. And if it's about a place that they've been to, that can be a little extra motivator. So those are just some things, and something that I hear from a lot of people, and it's fun. I did this a few years ago when my kids were a little bit younger, of just some case studies of seeing other books. We had been reading, some of you might be familiar with the Magic Treehouse books, and they're from all over the place, right? We'd been reading one about the Civil War. So we were driving, or another book, which I always highly recommend this. Some people know, again, these are kids' books. Dan Gutman is a famous author. He writes a lot of the My Weird School books and those. He also has this a few other really cool series. One's about baseball cards, another one's about history, the Flashback 4. I think there's 4 books, and this is about Gettysburg. So we were driving past Gettysburg, and we stopped and took the tour and saw some things, and my kids were a lot more interested in it because we've been reading the books than they would have been otherwise. So it was kind of fun to experience firsthand what I hear from a lot of families and young readers as well. Another one, just to show you, this is a book that maybe you haven't heard of, Seraphina and the Black Cloak, which is set at the Biltmore down in North Carolina. So the fact that we've been reading that before we went and visited the Biltmore, it was just kind of fun to kind of make that connection. And I think regardless of your age, it's a fun way, and I'm sure there's books that are more oriented for adults that you probably can relate to that as well. So that was kind of fun to see. But I wanted to show you just a few of the different historical places in the mystery series before we allow some time for questions. And just to give you a sense, and I assume most of you are here, one of the reasons you're here, other than the food and the good times of seeing each other, is to talk about an appreciation of history. So just to touch on some of the themes from each of the different books, and we'll go through quickly because it's with 12 books in the series, it's gotten a little bit more than there used to be. But I mentioned the first book already, that the brothers are looking for some lost coins. One of the things that is fun to show to kids and to grown-ups is some of these coins. When I was writing this book, we had some of those, and maybe you're familiar with those blue books where you can have the coins from the different years and you kind of fill in the gaps. They're fun to do. So we had seen a lot of these wheat pennies, right, which are still an older kind of coin, and you're probably familiar with these stalks of wheat on the back. And the coin before that was, before Abraham Lincoln was the front, is one that looks like this, which is an Indian head cent. Maybe some of you have seen some of these. You rarely run across one anymore unless you have an old collection or go to a coin store. And I was trying to do some research for what's something that kids could be looking for that's valuable but not like, millions of dollars that would be appropriate. And I found out about the 1877 Indian head cent, which maybe you know about. It was very rare. There wasn't very many made of them. And if you have an Indian head cent from 1877 in mint condition, it can be worth up to $5,000. And it's fun to kind of see the kids' eyes light up when they think about it. Oh, maybe one of my pennies is worth $5,000. So I send them on a hunt when they get back home that day and kind of looking under their beds and their closets to try to see one, and definitely encourage them to let me keep it safe for them. They don't usually take me up on that, but. So that's what they're looking for. One of the places up near where I live, and maybe some of you have been to Midlothian Mines Park. So the Midlothian area is famous historically for having a lot of old coal mines. So some of the pieces in the story were tied into that, and that's up in the area I live. So a little bit less history in the first book, and then I really leaned into that more as I went along. The second book, I talked a lot about this already, Mystery on Churchill, about its set up at St. John's Church. So I'm always interested, how many of you have been to St. John's Church in Churchill? I imagine a lot of you, right? And hopefully you've gotten a chance to go and see one of the reenactments, which they do a fantastic job, and they've really been a lot of high profile lately with the big anniversary coming up. But that's where Patrick Henry gave his famous speech. So in the story, the kids go on a class trip to St. John's, and while they're there, one of them goes down to the basement of the church, and they run into something very mysterious going on in the basement. And one of the fun things for me as a writer is I get to know a lot of the places that I write about, and I've really gotten to know a lot of the folks that work at St. John's over the years. And normally the basement is completely closed off and locked and things, but when a lot of kids and visitors go and they talk about the fact they've been reading the book, a lot of them will open the basement door and let them peek in and see down in underneath the church, so the kids always get a kick out of that. So that's a lot of fun. And there's George Wythe, who is the Wythe House there in Colonial Williamsburg, so maybe you've seen that. And he was Thomas Jefferson's law professor at the College of William and Mary. So lots of fun things of working in these true historical things, just like this little device here. I found some research is a solar microscope that Wythe invented, and he used it with his college students to basically be a projector on the wall to show them slides, which, considering how that was done back there, and he fastened it to the shutter of the window in the house, and you can tour the house and actually see the hole in the shutter when they would close the windows and fasten this device onto the shutter so it could project things up on the wall. So learning little tidbits like that and think, oh, that's pretty cool. How could that tie into a mystery? And making that one of the clues that they might find is a fun way to kind of mix those things together. Ghosts of Belle Isle is the third book. It's tied into the Civil War, and I could do a whole series of things just obviously about the Civil War in Richmond. It's always a little funny for a Yankee like me coming to Virginia and writing about the Civil War, so it's fun to mix that in. But this is particularly tied, when I was writing it, it was around the time of the 150th anniversary of the fall of Richmond. So pulling in places like Belle Isle and Tredegar and Hollywood Cemetery. I'm sure a lot of you have been to places like that where a couple presidents are buried, and the big Confederate monument, and Tredegar Iron Works. And one of the interesting stories that I found and worked it into the story, and I'm sure you might know about it, is the statue behind Tredegar of Abraham Lincoln and his son Tad, which is there in memory of the fact that one of the very last things that Abraham Lincoln did in his life was wait for the end of the war to be over, and this is a drawing of getting out and walking around the streets of Richmond and talking to the people in the streets. And that was literally just a few days before he went back to Washington and went to Ford's Theater. So kind of interesting little tidbits that you kind of run across that maybe you know, but a lot of kids are just not aware of those kind of stories, and it makes it fun to kind of tie it into some of the mysteries and the adventures. The fourth book is at the Jefferson Hotel in Richmond. How many people have been to the Jefferson? I'm expecting a lot of hands for most of these questions, so that's good to see. Again, not being from Virginia and exploring around Richmond, a lot of the early books in the series were specifically in the Richmond area because it's close to where I lived. So, so many interesting facts about the Jefferson, other than just being, a beautiful hotel. The main room inside with the staircase is just, gorgeous. And if you've ever been there over the holidays with the big tree or the gingerbread house they usually have is really cool. But the piece that really hooked me for the story and always captures the kids' attention is the fact that back when they opened the hotel over 100 years ago, they had real alligators that lived in the fountains in the lobby of the hotel, which, you just see kids go, would you want to stay at a hotel that had real alligators in the fountains? Like, oh my goodness, yes, I want to do that. You must be braver than I am. So just like, again, everywhere you look, there's always usually something tied into a place that has something really unique and interesting, and it's fun to kind of make that into part of a story. And I think as much as these are adventures, having it be a mystery that has to be solved kind of helps to kind of be that extra thing that pulls readers through and helps you get through the story. So that's a fun one. And the other piece of writing about history is in different places that I, as the author, just get to pick all my favorite places. So, I'm sure most of you have probably been to Maymont in Richmond, which was the home of James and Sally Dooley. So a lot of beautiful things at the mansion there. The famous swan bed that Sally Dooley had because she loved swans. And the kids are trying to track down some of the bald eagles that are part of the animal exhibits go missing. And one of the things that I found really cool, and this one I'm curious to see, how many people know about Swananoa? Has anyone been to Swananoa? Okay, I figured less hands. So the Dooleys had a summer home up on Afton Mountain in the Blue Ridge Mountains. So this is the picture. So this was, again, she loved swans. They named it Swananoa. And it's been through a variety of hands over the years, and you can take tours on the weekends sometimes now. But it's really, as I started to do my research, discovering, there's this, almost abandoned mansion that was their summer home up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's kind of a fun, kind of creepy way to put some stories into the mystery, and it's been fun to work with the folks there. I've had a couple talks and events and signings at Swananoa over the years too. So it's a fun way to kind of tie that together. Shadows at Jamestown, as you can imagine, is at Jamestown. I'm sure a lot of you have been there. It's fun to talk about. There's not just Jamestown Settlement, which is the big museum with all the replicas of the ships and the Indian village and the fort, but then historic Jamestown is the island where the people of Jamestown lived 400 years ago. So I had lunch with one of the archaeologists who talked to me about how their team is uncovering the thousands and thousands of artifacts from over the years of the people that live there. So this is a great tie-in. It was one of the Virginia Reader Choice books from the State Literacy Society a few years ago. And it's a great way. A lot of schools and classrooms do field trips to Jamestown. So the kids are going and working with the archaeologists at something called field school, which is in real life something that you have to be a college student for, but these guys get a lot of special treatment, so they get to do things a little bit early. And while they're there, they find something very mysterious. I don't know, everywhere they go, they keep running into these mysteries. I'm not sure what happens, but tied into the artifacts, and they have to kind of solve how that works out. So Jamestown is a fun one. Spies at Mount Vernon, as you can imagine, is tied into George Washington. And again, discovering some of the different facts about people that I thought I knew a lot about, like George Washington, is very fun. What got me started on this one was I was watching a great show. It's been a while now that it's out, but it was called Turn. I don't know if any of you saw that, about Washington spies. So it was really fascinating to find out that not only was George Washington all the things we know that he was, but he was also a spy master. So during the Revolutionary War, he had a whole network of spies that passed information and disinformation to help defeat the British. So tying that in there to different places associated with Washington, obviously at the Capitol building. One of the stories that I always get the biggest kind of bulging eyes from the kids that I love to talk about is when I went to the Capitol building, and maybe some of you have done this or know this as well, underneath the room that has the giant dome on it is this room here, which is called the crypt with the arches and the pillars here. And one floor below the crypt is a tomb that was supposed to hold George Washington's body. But when George Washington died, his wife Martha wouldn't let them move his body from Mount Vernon, from the home. So all these years that the Capitol building's been there, there's this empty tomb underneath the building, and I just think that's kind of creepy, you know? So it's kind of fun to find, again, just one of these little tidbits that is kind of fun to work into these stories, and it's amazing how the kids really latch on to some of those pieces as consistently some of the things that they enjoy the most. Or I keep saying kids, but I get lots of adults that keep coming back and saying they're enjoying the stories. So tying into Mount Vernon, I'm sure a lot of you have been to Mount Vernon, another beautiful place that you can spend just about all day too. And there's Washington's grave, if you've never been there, where you can actually see where he was laid to rest there next to his wife, Martha. The 8th book is similarly tied into Thomas Jefferson. So again, a lot of things that we know about Jefferson. This ties a lot more into the time when he was governor of Virginia. And when the British were invading and Jefferson actually had to flee to Charlottesville. So it's tied into lots of places that you probably are familiar with, from Monticello to UVA. One a little bit lesser known place is Poplar Forest. Has anyone been to Poplar Forest, just outside of Lynchburg? So that was Jefferson's vacation home, when they've done a fantastic job of renovating it, even since I've started working on the book. And they've expanded it in a lot of great ways. So I highly recommend going and visiting that. It has a smaller than Monticello, but it's really worth seeing. And one of those cool stories is, maybe some of you know about Jack Jewett, who was a person when the British were invading, and he was at the Cuckoo Tavern and overheard the British talking, and he did a Paul Revere type of ride to warn Jefferson at Monticello, and he got away just before the British got there. So again, all those kinds of stories are fun. There's me with Thomas Jefferson getting lots of good ideas from him. And another example of just looking for really interesting things was, I found out that one of Jefferson's library was the original foundation for a lot of the books of the Library of Congress, which actually had a couple stops and starts after it burned down, and they donated some more. And when I was doing my research at the time, I actually don't know if it's still there, but if you go to the Library of Congress, they have a special display, or this is a picture of it, of the books that they've found and specifically marked of the ones that were from Thomas Jefferson's collection, which as a New Yorker, it pained me to see that the owner of the Cowboys had done a lot of the donations to fund a lot of that, Jerry Jones, but it's kind of neat to see just things like that put together. So we'll keep going quickly, because I know there's a lot in here, and then save some time for questions. Book number 9 was interesting. I wrote this during the pandemic, and as we know, there's a lot of interesting things going on during the pandemic, but digging together some history of civil rights, which again, coming from New Jersey, didn't know a lot about Virginia's role in civil rights, particularly Prince Edward County, when the schools were closed down for 5 years because they didn't want white and black students to go to school together, which is obviously tragic. The Moton Museum, Barbara Johns, who was a very brave teenager years before that, that staged a protest at her school because conditions for white and black students weren't equal. And one of the cool things about Barbara Johns, since I've been writing that, back to the US Capitol in Washington, if you've ever gone, there's a room that has different statues, 2 from every state in the country. And one of the statues now for Virginia is of Barbara Johns. So I believe the only teenager that's one of the statues there. The other now is George Washington. So that's kind of a neat thing to see that recognized in the Capitol building there. Also, some of the civil rights history in Richmond, from Maggie Walker to Jackson Ward and Evergreen Cemetery. So a lot of interesting things, and obviously a very sensitive topic, and one that I didn't know a lot about. So I got a lot of research and did some interviews from students that were some of the first that had integrated some of the schools back in the 60s. So really interesting things that I was able to learn about too. The 10th book is Pirates on the Bay, which is tied into Blackbeard the pirate out in Virginia Beach, which, you know, I always love pirates, and it's always interesting. And one of the things, you know, that I found really interesting about Blackbeard, in addition to some of the different fun things around Virginia, is that Blackbeard, you know, I always tell kids it's not a good idea to be a pirate because they steal things and they take people's stuff and they're very mean. But Blackbeard, if you know anything about him, was a very smart pirate. And legend says that he had such a fearsome reputation, and as you can imagine, he was tall and had a big black beard, and legend says that he put lit fuses or matches underneath his hat so it looked like smoke was coming out of his ears, and also not a good idea, so please don't try that. But he was such a fearsome reputation that when he would attack merchant ships out on the sea, they saw that it was Blackbeard attacking them, and they almost always ran the white surrender flag up immediately. And we believe that he mostly had very few battles because of his fierce reputation, which if you're going to be a pirate, that's a good way to kind of stick around for a little while. Until the very end of his life, when the pirate hunters were finally onto him and he had to flee to his other hideout in the Outer Banks. And legend says that before he did that, he had to dump his treasure in the sand dunes in Virginia Beach to make his boat go faster so he'd get away. But no one has ever found the treasure that he dumped in the sand dunes. So in the story, the kids find some clues around Virginia Beach that seem to be leading to places where they might find that. And it's fun. I've done a lot of school visits down in Virginia Beach, and they literally know the little island next to the neighborhood where his hideout was, and it's in the neighborhoods like Treasure Island Road and different things, so it's kind of fun to see. But the kids get all excited about that and thinking about treasures. The last two books, and then we'll have some time for questions, is Danger on the Stage. So one of the ways, Virginia is not California or Texas, but it's actually surprisingly large, and there's surprisingly varied different regions within Virginia. So this is set way down in Southwest Virginia in a town called Abingdon. How many people have been to Abingdon? A really cute, okay, a few more. Lots of fun things there, and I didn't know much about it. I went to a school visit down that way, and they were telling me all about these different things. So it pulls in things like the Barter Theater, which got to go to a performance there. It took my family. It was Dolly Parton's 9 to 5. I don't think my kids have quite appreciated it as much as something else, but it was very well done. The Barter Theater, and you may know, is named the Barter Theater because it opened during the Great Depression. And when they opened it, a lot of people in the region didn't have enough money to pay for theater tickets. So the owner of the theater allowed them to barter some of their goods from their farms and produce and different livestock and things. And the history says that what's the lobby now used to be like a holding pen for the animals and the pigs and the cows, and must have caused a real ruckus back there. But it's still called the Barter, which is kind of a cool history. And then the Martha Washington Inn is another really cool historical place. It's been a lot of different things over the years, from a women's college to a hospital to a beautiful hotel now. And the Virginia Creeper Trail runs down there, so fun mountain bike experience that you can ride down the mountain. It's quite easy to do because of the elevation. So lots of fun things, and so the kids in the story go to see a performance, and in the middle of the performance, something goes dangerously wrong, and they have to solve the mystery. So fun to kind of pull out different places around the state. And then the newest one that was mentioned before just came out a couple months ago, Conspiracy at the Launch. And I started looking for some different topics and different areas. And space has always been something, and rockets been interest to me. And I started learning about things of Virginia and the space program, which I didn't really ever think of Virginia being tied into NASA or space. You think of Florida or Texas or something like that. So how many of you have been to Wallops Island, just south of Chincoteague, out on the eastern shore? So they regularly shoot off rockets there, some of which have supplied the International Space Station or weather balloons or all kinds of things. Langley Research Center is just outside of Hampton there. There's a picture of Wallops. Langley Research Center, and you might know, if any of you saw the movie a while back called Hidden Figures, that was all took place there at Langley Research Center, where a lot of the early mathematicians, a lot of them African-American women that were the calculators, essentially, which is where that word seems to have come from, of figuring out how to send the astronauts to the moon, which was really cool. So, as well as the National Air and Space Museum. So, fun to kind of pull in a lot of things around Virginia and some personal stories. One of the things I like to do is when I'm doing my characters or different ideas in the stories, what are some things that I can put some of my own experiences or friends or family. My dad was in the Air Force for 4 years, and when the original moon landing launched out of Cape Canaveral, my dad was a rescue helicopter pilot that was in the air when they were going to the moon. In case they had to bail, he was going to be one of the helicopter pilots that rescued them, which is cool. And I always thought that'd be a cool way to work that into a story. My mom was in the grandstands as well. So that's little elements like that to kind of work into the story in kind of a fictional way. And that's been the newest story coming out. So hopefully there's other things down the road. I've been usually doing about a book every year or two, but there's lots to do. I don't think I'd be able to cover all the history in Virginia. You could do hundreds of books, but it's fun to kind of come together and figure out a way to put that into stories and make that work out and see the reaction from different readers. So just we'll pause there and see if there's any questions. Happy to talk about anything about the stories or being an author. I know I didn't talk a whole lot about writing or being an author. That's a whole nother discussion we could have. But appreciate you having me and your attention, and happy to answer any questions that you might have about any of the places or the process or working with kids or anything like that.